Horae Apocalypticae, Volume 1, an historicist commentary on the Revelation, updated and revised for the 21st century, derived from the original work of E.B. Elliott, updated, revised, and read by Nicklas Arthur. Preliminary Essays, Essay 1, Section Roman numeral 2. So we come to the writers of the second half century subsequent to the publication of the Apocalypse, a period extending from AD 150 to 200, and which includes the honored names of Justin Martyr, the narrator of the Lyonese martyrdoms, Irenaeus, Melito, Theophilus, Apollonius, Clement of Alexandria, and Tertullian. In regard of all these, our task is indeed brief and easy. Their testimony to the apostolic authorship and divine authority of the Apocalypse is controverted and notorious. 1. Justin Martyr, a Christian philosopher, born at Sychem, about AD 103, it is supposed, converted to Christianity about 133, and who suffered martyrdom about 165. This man, to whose learning and piety testimony has been borne by nearly all the succeeding fathers, in his Dialogue with Trypho, written probably about the year 150, thus expresses himself: a man from among us, by name John, one of the apostles, in the revelation made to him, has prophesied that the believers in our Christ shall live 1,000 years in Jerusalem, etc. 2. Some 12 or 15 years after this, the narrative of the Lyonese martyrs was written by one of the surviving Christians of that city, that is about 177. It was addressed by the Gallic churches as a letter to the churches of Asia and Phrygia, including, of course, the 7 apocalyptic churches among them, and by Eusebius has been preserved to us entire. And in this letter there appears the remarkable expression in description of a true disciple, following the Lamb wheresoever he goes, the very words thus adopted from Scripture of the Revelation. 3. It was very soon after these martyrdoms that Irenaeus, previously a presbyter of the Lyonese church, became its bishop. He wrote his book on heresies, probably between AD 180 and 190, and in it he testifies many times most clearly on the point in question, speaking of the Apocalypse as the work of John the disciple of the Lord, that same John that leaned on his breast at the Last Supper, declaring, as will be seen in the second of these preliminary essays, the time when it was written, and speaking of various approved and ancient copies of that book of Scripture as then existing, confirmed by the agreeing testimony of those who had seen John himself. In short, a more clear and decisive testimony on almost every point on which information might be desired could scarcely have been given. 4. Next may be mentioned his contemporary, Melito, Bishop of Sardis, about AD 170, and who consequently may have presided over that see at the very time when the letter from the Gallic churches was sent to it. He wrote a treatise on the revelation of John, doubtless as on a book of apostolic authorship and authority, and thus is allowed by Michaelis to be one of the witnesses in its favor. 5. Of Theophilus, Bishop of Antioch, about 181. Eusebius says that in a work of his against the heresy of the Hermogenes, he made use of testimonies or quotations from John's Apocalypse. It was undoubtedly, as Michaelis allows, received by him. 6. Apollonius, a writer at the close of the 2nd century, and called by Jerome a most eloquent man, though probably not the same that, when accused before Perennis, the Praetorian prefect under Commodus about 186, read an eloquent apology before the Senate, and then suffered martyrdom, is also noted by Eusebius as one that acknowledged the Apocalypse and borrowed testimony from it. 7. Its reception by Clement of Alexandria, an inquisitive and learned writer who flourished, as Lardner gives a date, about 194, is as undoubted. He has frequently quoted from it and referred to it as the work of an apostle, and adds, as we shall presently see, his testimony to fix its date. Number 8. Finally, in this half-century comes Tertullian, the contemporary of Clement, the most ancient, and one of the most learned of the Latin fathers. His testimony to the Apocalypse is very full and ample. He quotes or refers to it in more than 70 passages of his writings, appealing to it expressly as the work of the Apostle John, and the same that wrote the first epistle of St. John. He also defends the authenticity of the book against the heretic Marcion and his followers by asserting its external evidence, thus appealing to the Asiatic churches on the point. We have churches that are disciples of John. For though Marcion rejects the revelation, the succession of bishops, traced to its original, will rest on John as its author. Thus far, not a single writer of the Church had impugned the genuineness or the divine inspiration of the Apocalypse of St. John. Only the Alogi, a heretical sect that rose up before the end of this half-century, and derived their name from an absurd antipathy to the term logos, did on this account reject both the Gospel of John and the Apocalypse of John, which alike gave the obnoxious title to Jesus Christ. The only other objection they pretended against the latter was that there was no church of Christians existing at the apocalyptic station Thyatira, of which statement, if referred to St. John's time, they offered no proof, and if referred to their own time, the circumstance did not militate against there having been one some 70 or 80 years before. Their ascription of the book to Cerinthus, who obviously could not be, as I have already shown in my brief anticipatory notice of these earliest objectors against the Apocalypse, did not help their case. And altogether, Michaelis confesses, the estimation in which they were held by their contemporaries was not sufficient to inspire much respect for them in a critique of the present age. Section 3. Early, however, in the next half-century, it is said, a man of some repute in the Church rose up to impugn the genuineness of the Apocalypse. I mean the Roman presbyter, Caius. If so, it was evidently under the influence of strong anti-millennium prejudices, and with almost as little just pretension to authority as his alogistic predecessors, since he appears to have urged no argument against it, except its, by him misunderstood, millennial doctrine, and with the absurdity of the Alogi, to have ascribed it to Cerinthus. But in fact, this view of Caius's meaning seems questionable. However, certain writers in Egypt, contemporary with him, or nearly so, under evident prejudices against and misconceptions of this millennial doctrine of the Apocalypse, attacked it as obscure, unconnected, and indeed false in statement, inasmuch as it being called a revelation, that which seemed to them covered with darkness, and represented John to be its author, when in fact it was the work of Cerinthus. These continued the line of objections and objectors from its first origin with the Alogi down to Dionysius, that same Dionysius bishop of Alexandria, about the middle of the 3rd century, of whose arguments I have already given a succinct account, and who, we have seen, though he entered with better judgment and temper on the inquiry, was yet unable, as his predecessors, to adduce any historical testimony whatsoever, of the least weight, to aid his argument. Meanwhile, the chain of testimony continued onward as to the genuineness and divine inspiration of the revelation. First, Hippolytus, a Christian bishop who flourished, according to Cave and Lardner, about A.D. 220. In his early years, a disciple of Irenaeus, and in more mature life, a martyr to the cause of Christ, not only elsewhere and otherwise bore testimony to it, but moreover wrote an express commentary on the Apocalypse, and this with so much weight of influence from his character, authority, and talents, that Michaelis attributes to it very principally the general reception of the Apocalypse thenceforward in the Church. 2. After him, Origen, the most critical and learned of all the ecclesiastical writers of his time, though a decided anti-millenarian, did yet receive the Apocalypse into the canon of inspired Scripture, and this without the slightest doubt, so far as appears, of its genuineness. What shall we say of John, is his observation of one place, who learned on the breast of Jesus? He has left us a gospel. He wrote likewise the Revelation, though ordered to seal up those things which the 7 thunders uttered. He left also one epistle, of very moderate length. And perhaps, I beg the reader to mark the discrimination exercised by him, perhaps a second and third, for of these last the genuineness is not by all admitted. 3. And with Origen, in East Africa there agreed, we know, on the important point of our inquiry, his equally eminent contemporary, the bishop and martyr of Western Africa, Cyprian. So ends our catena of testimonies to the genuineness and divine inspiration of the Apocalypse, traced as proposed through 3.5 centuries that followed after its publication, alike from east and west, north and south, from the churches of the Asiatic province and the Syrian, of Italy and of Gaul, of Egypt and of Africa. We have heard an unbroken and all but uniform voice of testimony in its favor. Nay, even what there is of contrary testimony has been shown only to confirm and add new weight to that which it opposes, for it proves how unable they who most wish it were to find evidence or argument of this kind of any real value, and such as could bear examination on their side of the question. Let me just add, by way of supplement to my sketch of the earlier historic evidence, that in what remained of the 3rd century, while no other opponent to it appeared of any note, the Apocalypse was received as the work of the inspired Apostle John, alike by schismatic Novatians and Donatists, and by the most eminent writers of the Catholic Church, e.g. Victorinus, Methodius, Arnobius, Lactantius. Further, that in the earlier half of the 4th century, while Eusebius doubted, Athanasius received it, and in its latter half, while Cyril of Jerusalem apparently hesitated respecting it, and Gregory Nazianzen and Chrysostom, though not rejecting, did yet but sparingly refer to it as inspired Scripture. It was, on the other hand, fully and unhesitatingly acknowledged, alike among the Greeks, by Epiphanius, Basil, and Cyril of Alexandria, by the Syrian Ephraim, and, among the Latins, by Hilary, Ambrose, Jerome, and Augustine. Subsequently, in the Greek Church, Though the book was never formally rejected by any ecclesiastical council, yet the same variety of opinion was expressed by its chief authors as by those of the 4th century. On the other hand, the Syrian Church seems to have received it after the time of its eminent doctor Ephraim Cyrus, the same as before, a church which had its ramifications not only in Assyria and Mesopotamia, countries nearest to the mother Syrian Church, but also in Arabia, Persia, Tartary, and China. By the Latin Church also it was notoriously and universally received, and in the Third Council of Carthage, held A.D. 397 and presided over by the great Augustine, it was solemnly declared to be included in the canon of inspired Scripture. And on the whole, and in conclusion, considering the early date, continuity, and strength of the external historical testimony to the book's apostolic Johannine origin, and on the contrary comparative lateness, brokenness, and weakness of all counter-historical testimony, considering, too, in reference to the internal evidence connected with the question, that, although the book's marked differences of style, and more strikingly Hebraic phraseology, as compared with that of St. John's Gospels and Epistles, might very naturally suggest a different authorship, yet this seems accountable for, in great measure at least, by the total different subject in the Apocalypse, and influence of the same divine afflatus that dictated the effusions of the old Hebrew prophets, whereas, on the other hand, the counter-internal evidence of the book's inimitable sublimity and holiness seems absolutely unaccountable for on any other hypothesis than that of an apostolic and inspired original. I say, considering and weighing the testimonies thus given in by this twofold kind of evidence, it does appear to me that Augustine and the Latin Council had good reason for their solemn verdict, and that we may safely and unhesitatingly direct our inquiries into the meaning of the Apocalypse, as into that of a prophecy of the future, revealed to the beloved disciple by none other than Christ's own divine, eternal, and omniscient Spirit.